In this video, I will start going over the parameters in the Muscle Constraint Properties Vellum node, and specifically this first, what I will call sub-tab here relating to muscle ends. So when I say sub-tab, this is just what I'm making up. It's not an official term, but I'm referring to these as sub-tabs, and these up here, the numbered tabs, are where you, the tab that you use to specify which group of muscles you are applying these settings to. And I just want to, before I dive into the muscle ends specifically, I just want to show you, first we need to enter the viewport state. So with my node selected, hit enter in the viewport, and this muscle ID selected pops up, and the muscles get highlighted, and you see the muscle ends mask displaying. If I switch it to muscle, it will show these connecting constraints over there. And it will also switch this sub-tab. On all the numbered tabs, it will make sure that it's got the matching sub-tab selected to whatever is being visualized. So if I switch it to muscle to bone, you see it pops to the muscle to bone sub-tab here, and it stays in that one in all of them, which is honestly really useful because otherwise you'll click here and then you'll go there and then you have to remember to click there. And so I try to get into the habit of using the visualize to set which tab I'm currently looking at. So yes, you can see you can also visualize collision radius, muscle to bone constraints are these lines, and it also shows a heat map, but it is not. Maybe it's because I have 3 duplicate. Do I have something displayed? Muscle end mask is overriding it. Okay, yeah, I don't know why that was on. So yes, this is what it should look like. So the muscle to bone will show this heat mask that corresponds to where the attachments are allowed, which you can edit, but I'll get to that later. Modified should be displaying the same as the muscle properties, so I think that's a bug. But in any case, let's look at muscle ends. So let's start by actually looking at this muscle ends mask. It's working in a very similar way to how the tendon mask radius is set up on the muscle properties. But remember, it's controlling a different property. It's controlling the attachments to the bones rather than the physical property of the tendons. But again, in the same vein as before, for your first numbered tab, I suggest toggling on all your parameters. For now, because I'm only looking at muscle ends, I'm only going to deal with this tab. And you'll see that by default, the radius value is half that of the tendon mask radius for the ends, but you can adjust that exactly the same way as with the tendon mask. And you also have this option here that you can toggle on to not scale the end radii by the length of the muscle. And also, I mentioned before, the axial ramp correction will only have an effect if it's not already on in a previous node. And then it would make sure that the orientations are consistent. But basically, always have it on. I think the only reason it's there is for backwards compatibility so that it doesn't break old setups and old files. So next I'm going to show that there is a similar issue to the muscle properties where there's a discrepancy between the parameter preset and the actual value that it gets initialized as when it's toggled off. So let's look here in points. And we are looking at the muscle end stiffness. Here we go. If I toggle this off, you see it goes to 1. So I believe the rest are fine, but the stiffness for all of these are initialized to 1 if this isn't toggled on. So again, just toggle them on in your first tab so that you don't get any weird, mysterious behavior. Again, in the same vein as with the muscle tendon mask, you can use a muscle paint node to edit your muscle ends. So Remember, you want to have it after your muscle constraint properties node, because this will initialize the values for you for most of your muscles. And then, whoops, I just pressed U to get up. Say you want to edit this, you can paint it maybe there, and maybe you want to basically remember the muscle ends act as a stiff pin. So perhaps if you have thin areas on the muscles that connect to the feet or the hands, those typically are not really you're not interested in simulating them, so you might just want to pin them. Okay. But again, don't put it upstream of your muscle properties and or your muscle constraint properties, because now it is going to initialize these values so that if you have the end regions toggled off, it will only take your incoming values and it won't give you any regions for free. And if you toggle it on, it will give you your regions for free, but it will not respect your incoming painted values. So put it after. I apologize if I sound like a broken record on this, but I fear that I've seen too many cases of it in example files for me to feel comfortable that it's going to sink in with only being said once. So next up, I want to actually display these constraints that are getting created, because if I look at the muscle to muscle constraints, the muscle to bone constraints, it displays the constraints, whereas the muscle ends, it only is displaying the mask. It's not actually displaying the constraints. And I believe the reason that it's not displayed here is because there's an important setting that controls it that's only set in the muscle solver. So I'm going to create a muscle solver node. I'm going to connect the muscles into the first input, and I want my bones in the second input. In this case, I've used the rest bones. Usually you will use animated bones, but because I'm not actually going to do a simulation here, I'm just going to use it to display the constraints that are created. It's fine to use the rest bones. And also because I'm just doing it for the visualization, I'm just turning off all of these to their lowest values so that it's not going to take too long to cook. Okay, so I'm going to turn the display on for the muscle solver. I'm going to go to the Guides tab, turn on attachment constraints, turn off muscle to muscle and muscle to bone, and turn on muscle ends. And now you'll see that it is showing in yellow in the viewport. So I've pushed the radius values for the end regions a bit higher than necessary, but partly just for illustration purposes so that we can see what the constraints are doing. Right, so for all the regions that fall within the end mask, it's going to look for the closest bone to that point, and it's going to look for the closest position on the surface of that bone. And it will create a connection between them. So let's look at how this relates to the actual values that we have on the constraint properties node. I'm going to pin it down so that I can keep editing the values while having the muscle solver viewport state enabled. And so the stiffness is going to be how much this connection can stretch. So how much it's going to let these points move away from the bone. And even though this seems like a fairly low number if you're familiar with Vellum stiffness values, under the hood it's actually multiplied by a factor of 1 million. So it is actually very high by default. So it should generally be high enough to behave the way you'd want it to. So even though the muscle to muscle and the muscle to bone have the same values, at least their default parameter values, under the hood they're not the same. So these are not multiplied by a factor of 1 million. So the muscle ends are 1 million times stronger than the muscle to bone connections, even though they're both connecting muscles and bones. Because of the difference in their strength, it relates basically because they have such different functions, they have different strengths as I outlined in my earlier video. So now the damping is going to be quite important here. because basically what it will do, the damping affects how quickly this constraint, the muscle to end constraint, is going to respond to changes in the position of the simulation points and the driving points. If the damping value is low, then it will allow the constraints to quickly adapt to the new positions. Whereas if the damping value is high, it will be more sluggish and it won't update as quickly. So it might seem to have the effect of lowering the stiffness, but it's more that it will lower it as it changes than that it will lower it absolutely. So basically, if your damping value is too high, your muscles at the ends will start to look syrupy and won't follow the bones. And if your damping value is too low, you will get jittering at the muscle ends. And what I've mentioned about damping value ranges in the previous video still applies. So what I said about damping before applies to all damping values. Right, so the distance threshold is going to be the radius. So this radius sets the radius on the muscle that determine which points count as the ends. Whereas the distance threshold is the distance that those endpoints search, the radial distance that they search for bones near them. So anything outside of that radius, it won't attach to, but anything within it, it will be valid for attachment. So that can lead to some unexpected behavior, such as if we look here, we see that this part of the muscle is attaching to the ribs here, where actually we'd only really want it to attach there. So it's going to be a combination of tweaking the distance threshold as well as the radii of the end regions to get that to go away. And if you might not always be having this display of the muscle ends the way I have here. And if you find that you have sort of weird spiking behavior where the muscle's getting pulled towards a bone that it shouldn't, that might be the culprit. And then another issue that you could have by this distance threshold is the fact that there isn't actually a bone close to this muscle end, right? So it hasn't got anything to attach to. I'd have to increase this distance threshold quite a bit before it finds any nearby bone. And it might be a bit strange and not really, you see, it's basically coming all the way like that. I believe the best solution in this case is, well, if your distance is too low to pick it up, it essentially will not be pinned like a muscle end. So you might have to use either your muscle to muscle constraints to pin it in place. Otherwise it might flop weirdly at the ends. Or another option would be to use a muscle glue constraint, which I will talk about later. Or this might be a situation where on the muscle solver, now I'll have to unpin this again to get back to the solver's properties. If I go to the simulation tab and I go to the constraints tab, there's this muscle ends option, which by default is set to constrain to nearest bone, but you can set it to constrain to target animation instead. And now you'll see those attachment constraints have disappeared because they only get created if you have it set to constraint to nearest bone, which I think is why it's not displayed in the muscle ends option here. But here it will take, if you have any incoming animation on your muscles, it will take that instead of as the target to constrain it to, instead of constraining it to animated bones. Unfortunately, you can't split it so that some muscles are constrained to bones and others are constrained to target animation, but at least this is an option. And the way you can, if you don't have any animation on your muscles, the way that you can create it is using a muscle flex node, which I will cover in a later video. I'm not going to go into detail about it now at all, but this does animate the muscles for you using a pointer form. In any case, I will delete that for now, and I will set this back to constraint to nearest bone. Although while we're here, I want to show that you can also disable the muscle ends entirely. Just to be clear, when we go to the help page, it says you can disable your muscle ends, and this is for the constraint properties node. And it's maybe a bit unclear, but you can't disable it on the muscle constraint properties node itself. You can only disable it on this muscle solver, right? So that's where you would disable it if for whatever reason you decided you needed to disable it. Just untoggling these values is not going to disable it, right? It's just going to initialize the values to whatever has been set under the hood. So just to be clear on what it actually means to disable the muscle ends. So I'm going to set it back to constraint to nearest bone. And now you see those constraints pop up again. We've gone through the stiffness, the damping, the distance threshold. Now for the compression stiffness, this is going to control, if we look at, say, this constraint line here. If this point tries to get closer to the bone, if the compression stiffness is higher, in this case 1, the constraint is going to resist allowing the point to move towards the bone. Whereas if you lower it to something like 0, it will allow it to freely move towards the bone. Then the rest length scale is, by default, whatever length it is on the input frame, well, on the first frame of your simulation, is going to be the rest length. But if you set the rest length scale to a value other than 1, it's going to tell the Vellum solver that actually the rest length is not the value that it is on the first frame, but it's that length multiplied by whatever you've set here. So that if you've set it to something less than 1, you're saying that the rest length is actually shorter than this. So the simulation needs to pull these points closer together. And because the bone isn't being simulated, it means pull the muscle towards the bone. And then once it's pulled, then it will be whatever stiffness or compression value you've set. Whereas if you set a rest length scale of bigger than 1, it's going to say, let this point move away from the bone until it's reached a length that is equal to this length times that. And then once it's reached that position, then you can treat it as if it has this stiffness. And if you have, I don't see a situation where you'd want a rest length scale of larger than 1. Generally, you wouldn't want your muscle ends to be allowed to move further away from your bones than they are in the starting position. But if they're maybe floating off the bones a little bit, if you made it less than 1, you can use that for the muscles to pull towards the bones a bit more closely. And also, if you wanted to reduce your compression stiffness, you can do that if maybe you have muscle ends that are sort of sticking out of the skin a bit. If they're poking out, then the compression stiffness, having that set to a lower value, can help it to squish in tighter when it needs to. And then we have the tangent stiffness. Now, the tangent stiffness, I'm not totally clear on what it does. If I understand it correctly, it is going to stop the muscles from twisting at the ends. So it helps to maintain the correct orientation of the muscle ends relative to their bones. So that if you wanted to twist more, you'll lower the tangent stiffness. And if you find that it's twisting or flipping, you can increase the tangent stiffness. One more thing I'd like to mention in this video is how the muscle end fall off affects the stiffness of these constraints. So you'll see even in these regions where the muscle end mask value is quite close to 0 but not quite 0, these muscle end constraints are still being created. However, under the hood, this stiffness value is being multiplied logarithmically by the muscle end mask. So you won't have extremely stiff constraints all the way up to here, the stiffness will decrease with the fall off. The reason it's a logarithmic fall off is because stiffness values multiply logarithmically, in the sense that you don't get much difference by varying them between 0 and 1. You need to vary them by factors of 10 to get significant effects. And obviously the muscle end mask is a mask that sits in the 0 to 1 range. So that's why it's logarithmically applied to the stiffness to get a fall off that will sort of make sense. But you might still be getting strange results from these type of connections that are connecting to the wrong bone. So it is worth looking out for those nevertheless. All right, in our next video, we will be looking at the muscle-to-muscle parameters.